this webinar. I was about to say seminar, but it is a webinar, okay, on immigration, citizenship and diversity in Wales. I just wanted to quickly remind you, I do not know if you had the opportunity to watch the presentation by Charlotte Williams, okay, a leading commentator on race and identity, working on ethnicity and multiculturalism, who chaired last year a group appointed by the Welsh government on the new school curriculum. And she delivered the annual lecture of the Welsh Centre of Politics on the 8th of June. And that was a sort of introduction to our webinar. And that was quite interesting. In this lecture, she analysed how race is represented in Wales, which she called race thinking. And she highlighted the importance of the draft Race Equality Action Plan published in March 2021, which according to her is a landmark, okay, for race and diversity in Wales. And so today, I'm happy to welcome my two colleagues, okay? So first of all, we're going to listen to Moya Jones, who is honorary professor in Bordeaux Montaigne, specialist of Wales, just back from Wales, okay, hopefully, working on Black Wales, a brief overview of ethnic diversity in Wales, a very interesting introductory presentation on diversity in Cymru. Okay, so over to you, Moya. And I'm just going to share, because Moya has a PowerPoint, which I'm going to share with you.
There we are.
Here it is.
Well, good morning. There we are. Thank you very much, Borida. Very nice to see you. Very nice to be back in France, having been confined to Wales, which is a lovely place to be confined to. But 6 months was beginning to be a bit long, and I really thought that today I would be talking to you from Swansea, but I'm not. So as Stephanie said, just an introduction, Cymru Ddu, Black Wales, something about ethnic diversity in Wales. Can we have, I'm going to do like the medical officer of England, I'm going to say, next slide, please. So can you give us slide number 2? Thank you. All right, so this is Wales. This is the cliches you think of when you think of Wales. The sheep, the castles, the lovely countryside, perhaps the mining history, maybe the sport and some famous people like Anthony Hopkins. But there's another side to Wales. Can we have the next slide, Stephanie, number 3? Okay, here's the football squad, and I hope you're going to watch them tomorrow when they play in Amsterdam against Denmark. But that being, all things being equal, let's hope they get as far as they did in 2016. Right. But before we talk about immigration and diversity, I have to give you some facts and figures just to refresh your memory. Can I have the next slide, please? So some facts and figures. Here's a little map of Wales, just to remind you of the size of it. Twice the size of Gironde, not densely populated, as you can see. And the latest population estimate, which has just been produced, is that there are now about 3.25 million people living in Wales. And it's the only part of the UK with 2 official languages. I'm interested in drawing your attention to the fact that if you can see that the main cities in Wales, Swansea, Cardiff and Newport, are in the south, southwest, southeast for the Cardiff and Newport. Okay, right. So something about the situation of Wales at the moment in the current context of Black Lives Matter, for example. Do you want to give me the next slide, please? Right. The current composition of the population of Wales is about 5%. 5% of the Welsh people self-identify as something other than white. You can see the figures here, 94.8% of Welsh people identify as white. And you know as well as I do that self-identifying is part of the census calculation. You can identify yourself. It's not a taboo subject. 5% as opposed to 13% BAME population in the UK and as a whole. And last night I heard that for London, this figure is 40%. There is a little bit of distribution differently according to age. Those under 16 is a slightly larger percentage of BAME population, but those are aged over 65, it's nearly the entire population. Okay, nearly 2% of the Welsh population identify as Muslim, and 2/3 of these live in South East Wales. So this is around Cardiff and Newport. And over the last 6 years, as governments have been gathering statistics, this population of people describing themselves as other than white has increased very steadily. Now, if we look at the next slide, please, this is the distribution of the population. All these statistics are available on the Welsh government website if you want to go and find them. You'll see that, for example, as I said just now, about 5.5% of people in Wales claim to be BAME in identity. When we come to the highest figures, Cardiff, you'll see I've highlighted 20% of the Cardiff population, 8.5% in Swansea, 13.2% in Newport. So as I drew your attention to the geography just now. But if you look up to Anglesey, there's hardly anybody. So that's Anglesey Island opposite, where you go to catch the ferry to go to Ireland. And other very, very low percentages in places like Powys and Ceredigion and Pembrokeshire. These are rural areas in the heart of Wales. They're heavily agricultural. And the other ones in Merthyr, Caerphilly, Torfaen, these are up the Welsh valleys where there's a very, very high rate of unemployment. So it's not attractive. It's not attractive. But you can see that unlike in England, you do not have strong concentrations of ethnic populations. And I'm sorry if I offend anybody this morning because I'm not using the right or the accepted terms these days. It's very, very difficult negotiating these waters. Okay, and can we have the next slide, please, Stephanie? Now, one of my problems has been that it's been in looking at the history of non-white populations in Wales has been the fact that for a long time, England and Wales was always a single administrative unit. That some of the books I found were very interesting. They talked about parish registers or household accounts, for example. Extremely difficult to extract any information, about Wales in particular. So the origins of other minorities in Wales, migration into Wales and those who settled, is mainly concentrated, first of all, in the port cities and especially in Cardiff. So in the 1850s, the first accounts of black sailors arriving in Cardiff, it's thought by some scholars that this is possibly related to the fact that slavery was abolished in the British Empire. And also, of course, there was a booming industrial revolution, and Cardiff was the #1 port for the export of coal. We do know that by the eve of the First World War that there were about 700 black people in Cardiff, but all settled in Cardiff Bay. And I'm just going to speak very briefly about Cardiff Bay. Can I have the next slide, please, Stephanie? Now, there's a little map of the south of Cardiff here on the right. Cardiff Bay is where the Senedd now is. But this was the old docks area. This is where the first incomers settled. And it was such a booming, such a thriving, such an amazing area. There was such a mix of nationalities. It was called Tiger Bay. And it's still referred to as Tiger Bay by quite a few people, although traces of the old Tiger Bay have completely disappeared. There were people from, it's the oldest multicultural, multi-generational community in the UK. And people from the Caribbean, from Africa, the Baltic nations, Yemen, Somalia, Ireland, Italy, Malta, China, Malaya, the list goes on. Settled there, married, raised families. Most of these people came at the beginning or prior to the first half of the 20th century. And there were smaller settlements in Newport and in Barry, but we can't say the same thing about Swansea. And there is a film called Tiger Bay, which was made in 1959, which you can now see as a feature film. You can now find it on YouTube, and it's well worth watching. It's very quaint, it's very charming. On the whole, this population lived perfectly happily together, although these riots in June 1919, which was a hot summer, are now well chronicled. You've got a little extract from the Western Mail there on the right. about fatal riots in Wales, in Tiger Bay. And there was a precedent to this in the summer of 1911 when there were anti-Jewish riots in Tredegar. But on the whole, there's relatively little conflict because numbers are low, and it's not because the Welsh are particularly tolerant, but you haven't got big populations with deep running conflicts like you have based on, for example, religion in Glasgow or Belfast or Liverpool. Anyway, as I said, Tiger Bay has been demolished, it's been regenerated. We've got the fabulous Mermaid Quay, we've got the Senedd building, very swish cafes, but nevertheless, Bute Town, this ward of Cardiff, this ward of Cardiff was found to be one of the poorest and most deprived wards in Cardiff and therefore in Wales. Okay, can we go to the next slide, please? Some research is currently being carried out by Norma Gregory, who started looking at black miners in Nottinghamshire, and she's extending her research now to cover the rest of the UK. And there were some interesting programmes on the television in late winter this year about the fact that black miners, everyone's black underground, that was the title, but black miners were part of the mining community and were working underground hewing coal. Can we go on then to the next slide? Thank you. So talking about the visibility, the invisibility of BAME minorities in Wales, and of course there are icons, the people who've got a public profile. Mostly artists and entertainers, sportsmen and women, and some of them are shown here, which if you're Welsh, you would recognise every one of them. The weather girl Benazir, Jason Mohammed, the journalist. You've got Ashley Williams, who was captain of the Wales football team. You've got Non Evans, you've got Colin Jackson, the runner, and then you've got two players who are currently going to Amsterdam for tomorrow's match. So you've got Talupi Falato and Josh Navidi. But these are visible. These are visible. Can we move on? So, as I said earlier, the situation in Wales now, things are changing. You've got the context of devolution. You've got Brexit. You've got Black Lives Matter. But we must remember that the Welsh government has no control over migration policy because this is a power that is reserved to the government, the UK government in London. We must also remember that within the BAME people and populations that we're talking about, there's a lot of diversity because not everybody has come to Wales to live or settle, or not everybody had ancestors who settled 2 or 3 or 4 generations ago, because there are also a number of refugees and asylum seekers in Wales. Not a huge number, well under 0.5% of the population, nearly 2,500 asylum seekers, quite a few more refugees, and there are 4 designated dispersal areas now in dotted about Wales. But just a quick word about the Black Lives Matter, because we've seen on the television, in the news and so on, the campaigns that have been carried on in most of the UK, which have been following the killing of George Floyd in the United States. But Trevor Phillips, the former chairman of the Equalities Commission, has said that Black Lives Matter doesn't apply to the UK. There's a different story to the United States. It's a different inheritance. It's a different colonial legacy or settlement legacy. He reckons that the main problem in the UK is still questions of class. But anyway, so I close that bracket and moving on. Moving on, please, then to slide 12. Thank you, Stephanie. We're talking about efforts to make an inclusive Wales. So just last week, June 2021, was designated Refugee Week in Wales. And Jane Hutt, who's the Minister for Social Justice, released a statement on the 17th last week, talking about Wales as a nation of sanctuary and outlining proposals for Wales to be a nation of sanctuary for asylum seekers and refugees from day one of arrival, for asylum seekers not to be placed in prison-like reception centres, which we've seen very alarming footage of in the past few years. But the idea that people should be placed into communities and taken care of with rights and legal advice and help and all sorts of services which the Welsh government, the Senedd, are prepared to fund. And you've got the names of some of them on here. So this is June 2021, but there have been earlier efforts, of course. So can we move on, please? Thank you. There is a Race Relations Council in Wales, Race Relations Council Cymru, who've been managing the Black History Wales programme and Black History Month Wales. They have organised exhibitions and events and communication campaigns and so on. One example was the exhibition that they organised in 2018 called Icons of Black Wales, to mark 11 years of the fact that Black history was being marked in Wales. There's also been another one, Brilliant Black and Welsh, to mark the arrival of 70th anniversary of the arrival of the Windrush in the Empire Windrush. And in fact, the Senedd even have a Windrush Cymru page, which you can go and have a look at. So a move being made, I'll talk about this a little bit more in detail in just a moment, but about Black history being taught in schools and a campaign called Our Voices, Our Stories. So can we move on? So this is building an inclusive Wales. This is what Stephanie was talking about earlier. The Racial Equality Action Plan is a plan which is to be implemented in Wales following a consultation exercise. And this consultation exercise will end in about a month's time. So if you want to take part, you can. You can go online and you can find this and you'll be asked for your opinion. So the idea of the Racial Equality Action Plan is, you can see the ideas here, the major one being to make Wales anti-racist by 2025. And to do so, goals and action and outcomes are going to have to be identified in pretty many areas. You've got them there in front of you, you can read them. I'm particularly interested, you can see I've put it in bold, in the fact that the Welsh language hasn't been forgotten. The Welsh language is part of Wales being inclusive. So a little bit about this. Charlotte Williams was actually appointed by the Welsh Government to lead this working group and to improve the teaching of themes related to BAME communities and their experiences across the school curriculum. So at the moment, they're looking at resources, they're looking at how to teach these themes, how to get them into the curriculum. And one of the recommendations that's already come out is that the national curriculum for Wales for 2020 for primary and secondary pupils should include teaching of what they've called Commonwealth history, the idea being to prevent racism and to promote cultural diversity. So these ideas, of course, as I've just said, are central to all these actions. Now, this is not the only action being taken at the moment. There is something which is a little bit more fundamental. Can we go on to the next slide, please? And this is an act which the Welsh Parliament passed in 2015, Wellbeing of Future Generations. This is extremely interesting as a piece of legislation because the idea is looking at Wales as a whole, socially, economically, environmentally, culturally. And the idea is to make public bodies think about how to act in the long term, about how to work better with people and communities, and to work together. So again, you've got the goals, I've got them listed here for you. Again, one of them is culture and language, but also the place of Wales in the world, the very last one, a globally responsible Wales, which chimes with Welsh ambitions to have a country where all development is sustainable. So some of these institutions, can we move on, please? Some of these institutions which are involved are here. So it's pretty much all aspects of life in Wales, obviously political authorities, but it does include health boards. It does include the Great Outdoors, Natural Resources Wales, and then institutions like the library, the museum, HEFCU for the funding of universities. And I took this quote from the Act that all this should be achieved through sustainable development. So sustainable development, to think about the long term, and as it said in the previous slide, to think about joined up thinking. You don't just do it on your own, make sure that you're working hand in hand with other institutions. There are also 46 wellbeing indicators, national wellbeing indicators, and the Senedd regularly publishes data on these. Now, if we can move on to the next one, when I'm kind of moving towards a conclusion. I'm not going to talk about this too much because Stephanie's going to be talking about this. I've showed you sports icons, I've showed you entertainers, There are many, many more who are less well known, if you like, but who are definitely present in Wales, artists and actors and theatre producers and musicians and community leaders and club leaders and so on. But the point is, where are the political leaders? Where are the visible political leaders in Wales? And they haven't yet come to the top. They have not yet come to prominence. Cardiff had its first Lord Mayor in 2019-2020. This is an honorary position. Lord Mayors of cities change once a year. It's a councillor who's chosen to be the Lord Mayor. And in the elections earlier this year to the Senedd, three Senedd members were elected. You've got Vaughan Gething there on the left, who represents Cardiff South and Penarth. He was the Labour Minister of Health, so he's been very, very present on the TV every night talking about COVID-19 and the progress of the disease and the vaccination rollout. But he's now got a different job. He's now responsible for the economy and for transport questions. Natasha Ashgar, who's been elected on a regional list as a Conservative for South Wales East, and on the right, Altaf Hussain, again elected on a regional list, again a Conservative. And his photograph was taken inside the Senedd building, I note. Anyway, so can we go on, please? There we are. So the specificity of Welsh identity and has always been something that was ethnic. But when it was ethnic, it used to mean Welsh versus English. And the identifying factor of the language has always been massive. There have been many, many questions and fears over the years. What is Wales? Who speaks for Wales? What is the nature of this nation? And many legitimate fears regarding the impact of non-Welsh speakers on the language heartlands. I haven't shown you a map of where the Welsh heartlands are, but basically they're in the centre of Wales and up in the northwest and the northeast. But there are pockets of Welsh speakers all over Wales. But this is true of any in-migration. One of the most hated groups of migrants into Wales is English people who buy second homes there and come in speaking English and expecting everybody else to. There was a pretty shocking incident in Hay-on-Wye 2 weeks ago when, I don't know if it was a bookshop, but threw some customers out for speaking Welsh. But anyway, so the REAP online survey takes this into account. You'll remember that I put it in bold. And the first thing that quite amused me was the fact that you're allowed to send in or you're invited to send in your contributions, your opinions, using any language you prefer. And then they list languages, for example, Hindu, Punjabi, French, German, Polish, English, Welsh. So it really is any language you want. But the two questions that interested me in particular about the REAP are these ones, 14 and 15. Do you think it will support people who speak Welsh? And what can we do to make sure it's as valued as much as English, it being a priority area? So I haven't participated. I've got till the 15th of July, as have you. And I'm thinking I might well go in and answer these questions. Can we have the last slide then, please? So Vaughan Gething himself, writing in the introduction, the preface to the re-edition of Wales, A Tolerant Nation, speaks about the fact that devolution is now well embedded. Wales is now used to having a Senedd, a Welsh government. And in recent years, many people have expressed appreciation of the fact that there is a buffer between Wales as a whole and powers in London and Westminster, in particular, in the past couple of years. He also points out that Wales is subtly different to the rest of the UK. Yes, all the nations of the UK are different. They don't really resemble each other. But I think it's because of the language problem in particular in Wales. But that's me, obviously. That's something I'm particularly interested in. But this is not a recent question. The Parrott report of 2000 spoke already about the UK. This was before devolution was really well embedded, as Vaughan Gething says, before Brexit, before the events which are now splitting us apart. The need to rethink the national story. He was talking about the UK, but he's right when he says about the fact that events that used to unify us, shared memories like World War II, are disappearing. There are practically no more veterans left. We have ceremonies to honour them, but they are not around. And institutions that held us together, like the NHS, have fragmented. There's been a lot of support for the NHS during the recent, during the ongoing pandemic, but it's NHS Wales. It's not the NHS UK. So Wales is rethinking its national narrative. It is moving more towards civic nationalism. And I found these two lovely pictures. One on the left taken a good time ago of some old Welsh ladies in traditional costume, and one taken, the one on the right taken at Cardiff University. And this is Wales today. These are young people. What I do have to tell you that's not on this slide is that the number of Welsh-speaking people is diminishing. The population survey, the annual population survey, which dates from this year, has estimated that there's about 861,000 people who claim to speak Welsh. So that's about 28.5% of the population. But this number has dropped since last year. About 250,000 people, Welsh speakers, have disappeared from this survey. Now, statistics, you can do with them what you want, but if this is true, well, where are they? Have they left Wales? Have they died? We don't know. Anyway, so the last slide, please. And I'll say thank you very much. Diolch yn fawr. Very sincere thanks to the staff at the Swansea Central Library, because they were absolutely wonderful. I wrote to them, because you can't go into libraries, and said, this is the topic I'm working on. Do you have this book and this book? And they came back and said, oh, we've got many, many more. And they ordered them for me from regional libraries. They got them to Swansea. I nipped in, washed my hands with hand sanitizer, took the books and so on, and they were amazing. So thank you very much to them, and thank you to you as well for listening and for inviting me along this morning.
Well, thank you very much, Moya, for this very interesting presentation. I think allowing everyone present today, even people who are not specialists of Wales, to really understand better life in Wales and the reality of diversity in Wales, through history and the situation today. Anyone, I mean, feel free to ask any questions you want. Just before I just have a few comments. Well, first of all, you're mentioning a book, just wanted to show it to you. The book you were mentioning, okay, that's the one published in 2015, A Tolerant Nation. Yep. Okay, that's a very interesting book for anyone interested in issues of diversity, immigration, and so on. So that's the one that is mentioned on your list, very interesting one. And just another one I want to show you. I'm not a bookseller, okay, this is just to show you interesting books. Because you were talking about the Well-Being of Future Generations Act, voted in 2015, and I agree with you that it is a major piece of legislation, in my opinion, revolutionary. But I've always said, I'm sorry to defend Wales, but I've always said that Wales was revolutionary and showing the way for sustainable development. I just wanted to show you that second one that is really good as well, published by Jane Davidson, okay, the minister who was at the origin of the Well-Being of Future Generations Act, and really fought to have this act voted. And it's a very, very interesting book, Lessons from a Small Country, okay, about the voting of this act and how she managed, you see, to get support for this act. Well, and the last comment, my last comment was when you were talking about icons of Wales and especially sportsmen, since you were talking about football and the last cup in France, and especially in Lyon, with Wales playing in Lyon. And I just wanted to remind you, someone everyone came to know in 2016, and that was Gareth Bale, okay? Everyone knew about him and he was everywhere, and that was quite funny to see that people were discovering that he was Welsh and not British. So
yeah, but they know Gareth Bale because he plays for Real Madrid. But,
yeah, that's why he's so famous. Well, sorry, that was just a small parenthesis on football. No. We're right in the middle of it. So, okay, I don't know. Well, I'm just going to stop sharing. It will be easier to see every one of you. I don't know how you want to do. If you want to have a few questions now to Moya, or if we go on with Elizabeth, because the subject is going to be quite different. So do not hesitate, I think, if you have a few questions now. Vincent.
No, I was going to say that usually we take all the questions at the end of the session, but it's up to people. If people have questions, then we're very happy to have them, but usually we take them at the end of the session, right?
Okay, so. Well, that's fine for me. Just in case you had burning questions that could not wait. But so we're going to move on to Elizabeth. So I'm very happy to have Elizabeth with us today, Elizabeth Gibson-Morgan, professor in law and languages at the University of Poitiers and at the Bordeaux Law School as well. Okay, so she's very busy at the moment. So thank you very much for being present today. And she's also visiting senior research fellow at King's College London. She refuses to describe herself as a specialist of Wales, but she has some acquaintances and a useful insight, okay, on the legal and judiciary aspects of these issues. So I'm very happy to welcome her today. And she's going to present a talk on protecting Welsh people as court users and judicial diversity in Wales. So thank you very much, Elizabeth, and over to you.
Bore da, thank you very much, Stéphanie, for your kind words. I'm very pleased to see everybody, to see Moya, Vincent, Romain, very good friends. It's a great pleasure to be here. I would like to focus on important themes, I think, like judicial diversity, access to justice in Wales, a distinct justice for Wales. These are among the main themes that I would like to discuss, and I will divide my talk into two, focusing on the Welsh history of the law of Wales, that is to say, a well-established, rich legal tradition, and then from a shared judiciary to the emancipation of Welsh law. Well, justice is not an island. Well, this is what was said, in fact, in the report published by the Independent Commission chaired by Lord Thomas of Cwmgyrdd, the chair of the Commission on Justice in Wales. So what we are about to study is not, to discuss, is not justice in general, but justice in Wales for the people of Wales. Well, Moya asked the question of what is the nature of Wales, and I would like to say a few words about that. But the UK, as we all know, is a multinational, multiracial, multi-ethnic country. And as Linda Coley wrote, it's a mosaic of nations. We could also add a mosaic of people, including Wales. So it is diversity, cultural diversity is one of its key characteristics. Devolution itself is about diversity, as Lord Morgan pointed out a few years ago. Yet, in terms of judicial diversity, which is discussed in the current paper, well, in the words of Nathalie Lewin QC, the UK remains significantly worse than other European and common law jurisdictions. She chaired a working party that issued a report entitled Increasing Judicial Diversity for this charity called Justice, promoting a fair, accessible and equal justice system. So the report, in fact, of this all-party organization concluded, I quote, that much more must be done to strengthen diversity. For what? For reasons of legitimacy, quality, and fairness. And we could say that the same motivations and objectives inspired the experts that reviewed justice in Wales. So where does Wales stand? Well, Wales is rarely in the news, except when you mention it during either the rugby tournament of the Six Nations, or when it wins at football, as it did recently. Well, maybe because it is small from a geographic and demographic viewpoint, but it is generally thought of as a kind of homogeneous single entity. However, it is itself a diverse nation. Shahinur Alam, a youth supporter worker at Newport Youth Future, recently interviewed in the Welsh Agenda, pointed out that approximately 6 to 8% of the Welsh population identify as Black, Asian or other ethnic minority, and almost 250,000, most concentrated in the south of Wales. Wales is a nation, not a state. And even if the Welsh distinctive flag is among the oldest in the world, we owe it to the Roman legion. I remember very well, it was striking many years ago, Stéphanie said, but it is not in fact visible in the Union flag, and I think it was very significant. So people are not necessarily very familiar with the Welsh nation. It's still sometimes referred to as a peripheral territory of the UK. And the Welsh historian Kenneth Morgan described the very proximity of Wales to England as a major obstacle to Welsh assertiveness. So it has a people, a territory, but with significant differences to the north and the south, and with the northwest Wales as the Welsh-speaking heartland. But it is also a diverse nation from another point of view. Well, Wales is not Catalonia, it's a poor nation. Although it is culturally and linguistically very rich, it is economically poor. Steel and car industries were hit by Brexit, like Port Talbot, for example. Tourism was severely affected by COVID-19. And I think that those two major crises, Brexit and COVID-19, were in fact described by Michael Woods as great magnifiers of the Welsh social and economic inequalities. And in his detailed analysis of the rural-urban disparities in Wales, which have been aggravated by COVID-19, this professor of human geography, co-director for Welsh politics at Aberystwyth, Michael Woods pointed out, I quote, that the pandemic has reinforced social, ethnic and spatial inequalities in Wales. All tensions in rural communities over public services, in fact, have also been emphasized or aggravated by the COVID-19 crisis. So far from being the great leveler, as it was in fact put forward by the UK Prime Minister Boris Johnson, COVID-19 has increased social and economic inequalities in Wales and in the rest of the UK too. Yet, and I'm sure that Stéphanie will mention him, the First Minister, the Labour First Minister, Mark Drakeford, in fact has done very well in the last election and has handled the pandemic quite well, and is a trusted and esteemed politician, as Stéphanie will explain. But justice itself has not been spared. In other words, it has experienced its own difficulties. There's a lack of judicial diversity, as I said before. It is one of the three branches of government that Wales doesn't have. It has its own institutions, its own government, its now own parliament, the Senedd, that was mentioned by Moya, but it still doesn't have its own legal system, its own justice as such, unlike Scotland. And this can be explained, well, this is for historical reasons. So we could say that Wales is the only one of the four nations which doesn't have its own legal system. It shares one with England. And as the former First Minister Moya Jones observed, I quote, Wales is the only legislature without its jurisdiction. Now, in legal English, one speaks of the judiciary, meaning the judicial power, the system of courts and tribunals, and finally judges. And once again, Wales has still none of them, except for Welsh tribunals, in fact. Let us also bear in mind something important. Justice is not a default matter. Even under the new model of devolution introduced in Wales by the Wales Act of 2017. The one element of justice administration devolved has to do with Welsh tribunals, as we will see. However, and I would like to do the same as Moya did. Moya identified a few very successful Welsh people that have given Wales more visibility. Now, we can indeed identify today some Welsh eminent lawyers who hold strategic positions today outside Wales, starting with Robert Buckland, QC. Well, you can think that he's a controversial character. He's the current Lord Chancellor and Secretary of State for Justice, the longest serving Justice Secretary since Chris Grayling in 2015. And he was born in Llanelli, which is twin with Agen, in my part of France. Robert Buckland has long experience as a criminal barrister, then a part-time judge in a Crown Court. And what is interesting, and you will see the link with what I'll say in a few minutes, he worked himself for a long time as a lawyer dealing with legal aid cases. So he was in fact a legal aid practitioner for 20 years. You can also think of David Lloyd Jones. I always have to be really careful with his name because I'm tempted to give him another name. Lloyd Jones, one of the 12 justices of the UK Supreme Court, who is really trying hard to codify Welsh law. And of course, there's also someone else that I've mentioned, the former Lord Chief Justice, the first Welsh person to hold such an office, Lord Thomas. So a few years ago, in December 2017, the Welsh government of Cymru Jones appointed an independent commission on justice in Wales to, I quote, to review the operation of the justice system in Wales and set a long-term union for its future. Among its main objectives were to try to reduce crime, promote rehabilitation, that is to say, develop a more constructive approach to justice, to crime, and there was also a strong determination to improve Welsh people's access to justice. So it really focused on the needs of Welsh people as court users. Now, are Welsh people like any other court users? Well, I think that they are often identified as vulnerable court users faced with, in fact, several challenges, legal and linguistic complexities, as we will see. Now, very rapidly, I would like to give you a kind of historical account of the law of Wales in the first part, which was very much influenced by the autonomous Welsh princes of the Middle Ages. I won't be too long. This is something that I developed during the SOS, but just a few lines, in fact. We can note that before the Union of England and Wales in 1536, Wales went through a long, rich political and linguistic journey marked by the long-lasting influence of Roman law, with over 300 years of Roman rule. And the latter explains the importance very early on of a written legal culture based on Roman law, based also on the reduction of Welsh customs into writing, as the historian Thomas Glyn Watkin explained in his extensive history of, or legal history of Wales, published in 2012. And it was, or the law was in fact codified by Cuneva in the 5th century, and more extensively by Howell Va in the 10th century, as well as the lasting influence of Latin. So we could say that, of course, later on, Edward I imposed a form of legal and territorial uniformity on Wales, trying to align Welsh law and territory with the English common law. And we could say that this form of annexation was, of course, completed by the two Acts of Union of 1536 and 1543. which fully established a shared, in fact, judiciary, and also tried to suppress the Welsh language at the same time. However, the positive aspect of the two acts is that they established local courts of quarter sessions and great sessions where Welsh was widely used. So it was only with the abolition of the Court of Great Session in 1830, which administered justice in Wales in civil and criminal matters, that England and Wales really merged into a single legal entity. So to conclude that first part, I think that the history of law in Wales would reflect a distinct rather than a separate legal jurisdiction. Now, today we can observe the growing body of Welsh law, of course, due to first Welsh Assembly, then Welsh Parliament. And what is important is that for the first time in centuries, judges who hear cases in Wales now receive training in the laws applicable only in Wales and in the Welsh language. However, as it is mentioned in the 2019 report of Lord Thomas, I quote, the fundamental problem lies in split in two governments and two legislatures of responsibilities for justice. So in the second part, quickly, I would like to show you that Wales is trying to move from a shared judiciary to the emancipation of Welsh law, more respectful and better adapted to the needs of Welsh court users and to the Welsh diversity. Now, first of all, we can note that justice in Wales is still very much under the control of Westminster. There is indeed a lack of autonomy, starting with a lack of financial autonomy of justice in Wales. Policy and spending on justice, as it is mentioned in the report, are still controlled by the Westminster government. And what we can note is that Wales and Welsh court users were directly and severely affected by 20 years of austerity, which more or less, started with the 2010-2015 UK coalition. And what we can note more particularly is the impact of those cuts on legal aid, undermining access to justice for Welsh people and beyond the rule of law itself. Now, one of the pillars of the legal framework of devolution and of people's rights in Wales is the European Convention on Human Rights. And this will remain because, the UK will remain a member of the Council of Europe. So let us bear in mind the importance of its Article 6, which protects the right to a fair trial, which of course includes access to legal advice and representation. Well, my point here is to say that the Legal Aid Sentencing and Punishment Act of 2012, has a huge impact on the most vulnerable court users in Wales. It led to the reduction of 28% of legal aid expenditure in the UK and 37% in Wales. So I think that it led to what the 2019 report described as advice deserts in rural and post-industrial areas, Welsh court users having to defend themselves in person because they cannot afford or could not afford legal counsel. And this is a serious matter because it increases the risk of miscarriages of justice. We can also think of the impact of those policies on courts. In other words, court closures, especially the closure of magistrates' courts. Now, there are important courts because they are the ones which are close to the community, close to the people. We can note a significant decline of magistrates from around 30,000 to around 15,000. And today, there are only 1,130 magistrates in Wales. So, and only 12% of them are BAME people. So we can see that the closure of magistrates' courts, closure of courts more particularly, has affected rural Wales. People having to travel long distances to go to the nearest magistrates' courts. So this, I think, was a kind of short-term policy, but with a long-term impact for Welsh court users, in fact. You could say, well, with the coronavirus pandemic, justice has moved online. So can't they use remote justice? Yes, but the problem is remote justice has not necessarily helped vulnerable court users in rural Wales, because they do not necessarily have access to the internet and do not necessarily have, let's say, the expertise or knowledge of how to use it, especially people who suffer from mental illnesses, for example. So I think that part of the problem or part of the question is linked to the priorities of the UK government and the way it's allocated funds, putting the emphasis also on punitive policies. And there's something that I would like to underline here, which is the question of Welsh prisons, which is also a key problem. Now, Wales has a record high in terms of incarceration rate, as it is also clearly mentioned in the report. And there is an additional problem in Wales. There is an absence of prisons for women. Or you will say, yes, but women represent a tiny minority of inmates. Yes, but once again, they are among the most vulnerable ones. They are particularly vulnerable and more likely to commit suicide in prison or to self-harm than male offenders, for example. We can note also that BAME people are overrepresented in the criminal justice system in Wales. If we look at the average percentage of Black offenders receiving a custodial sentence in the Crown Court, it's 74% compared with 63.8% in England, and are also more likely, this is where I should have begun, by being more likely to be stopped and searched by the police. So the paradox is that they are overrepresented in the criminal justice system or in prison, we could say, and yet underrepresented in the judiciary in Wales, because if you look at figures, there are only 3% of court judges in England and Wales, or in Wales, are in fact the BME court judges. And in fact, this is a problem which was put forward in an article that I found particularly interesting, which was published, I think, by the Sunday Times, which denounced the discrimination against BMA judges, in fact, and lawyers by their white counterparts, and asking for a parliamentary inquiry into a form of discrimination and bullying in the judiciary, in the judiciary. So that's a serious problem. And of course, there's finally the problem of backlog of cases aggravated by the coronavirus pandemic. So what can be done? Well, there are some recommendations in the 2019 report itself, and possible solutions, alternatives to a shared justice. I just want to point out some of them. What the experts of this commission recommend is a single minister or deputy minister in the Welsh government, or a new justice department in the Welsh government led by a cabinet minister. They want the full implementation of the Welsh languages measure 2011, which put on the same footing in the English and Welsh languages. They indeed should be treated equally. This is what the law says. but this has still not yet been implemented. They want also a Welsh justice in the UK Supreme Court. We would say, yes, but you've just mentioned David Lloyd Jones. Yes, but this is a kind of one-off, if you want. What they want is a substantial, permanent change. They would like perhaps a new convention to be established, like the one which exists for Scottish judges. By convention, you have 2 Scottish judges in the UK Supreme Court. So they want the equivalent for Wales because of the specificities of Welsh law. And finally, and this is where I will conclude, the main recommendation is, of course, either to devolve justice and policing, or better still, to give Wales its own distinct, yet not separate legal system, starting with the Welsh High Court and the Welsh Court of Appeal. Because, and that's one of the key recommendations of the 2019 report, I quote, the law applicable in Wales should be formally identified as the law of Wales, distinct from the law of England. Yet opinions are divided within Welsh legal experts themselves about whether it would be preferable for Wales to have a distinct or a separate jurisdiction now that Wales issues its own laws. Well, a separate Welsh jurisdiction might appeal to the Welsh at first sight, but it raises a whole series of material, technical, maybe also financial difficulties. There's also the problem of the need for the mutual recognition of legal qualifications of Welsh lawyers, and also to make sure that they would be able to practice outside Wales as well. So it is not that as easy as it seems at first sight. And that's why I think people like the former First Minister Cymru Jones, a lawyer himself, is more favourable to a distinct rather than a separate legal system. So just a few words to conclude. Wales is faced with its own challenges, which are once again how to accommodate the growing divergence between English law and Welsh law, while making the law and courts more accessible to the people living in Wales. And I just would like to end with one of the conservative MPs, for Wales, it's the Conservative MP for Aberconwy, Robin Miller, who said, oh, well, we believe our country has a great past and a great future. But I do not know about the past except for the golden age of Hywel Dda, or the victories of Owen Glyndwr, the Welsh prince, before the Act of Union. But let us indeed hope for a brighter future for Welsh court users and for Wales. Cymru. Diolch yn fawr.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this presentation on, very important aspects of Welsh life, as you said, affecting vulnerable people, and the fact that they should have access to justice, and this equality of access to justice that is extremely important, especially for BAME people, as you said. So thank you. And important issues for the future of Wales as well, in terms of this separation or distinct legal jurisdiction. So, so thank you very much. So, as we said, we're going to move on. So now it's my turn, okay, to speak today. I'm just going to share with you my document, hoping it's going to work. It should. Yes, here it is. You can all see it. I think it should be working properly. Yes. Well, before I start, I just wanted to thank you all for being present today, for paying attention to Wales, because usually events dealing with Wales do not attract so many people. So thank you very much for being present today to listen to presentations about Wales. So I'm going to talk about this subject, electing a more diverse Senedd, citizenship and diversity in the May 2021 Welsh elections. With this expression, electing a more diverse Senedd, taken from, in fact, a report published last year. So, well, I'm not going to deal with really the results of the elections, because I've already spoken about them, but more dealing with this issue of diversity during the elections. In a book entitled How Parliament Works, published in 2018, Robert Rogers and Roger Walters claimed that, I quote, a man or woman or someone from an ethnic minority or a single parent may perhaps be thought to have a better understanding of the outlook of men, of women, of ethnic minorities, or of single parents. Nevertheless, the MP's job is to represent the diversity of the people in the constituency in a conscientious and professional way. Understanding your constituents is part of doing the job well, whether or not you have a particular affinity with one group or another. There is no denying, indeed, that any member of parliament must represent all his or her constituents, and yet decision-making and outcomes are regarded as better as a result of a greater variety of opinions, experiences and perspectives, which also contributes to a better confidence in the extent to which the legislature represents all the people and communities it serves equitably and fairly. And that is why the Committee on Senedd Electoral Reform, set up on the 18th of September 2019 and chaired by Dawn Bowden, member of the Senedd, made a series of recommendations in the report published in September 2020 entitled Senedd Reform, The Next Steps, on how to improve the workings of the Senedd, the Welsh Parliament. Sorry, I said the Senedd, that's a habit I have, but I should say the Welsh Parliament was the same thing. So on the workings of the Senedd, and to elect a more diverse assembly, and the committee listed voluntary as well as legislative measures, such as requiring political parties to publish diversity and inclusion strategies and collect, anonymize and publish data about the diversity of their candidates, which corresponds in fact to section 106 of the Equality Act 2010, yet to be enacted. Okay, so this is a section of this act, but not yet enacted. So that's why it was a recommendation and not an obligation, which would mandate political parties to publish equality data in a coherent and standardized format. Following a campaign launched by a coalition of 15 organizations demanding diverse 50-50 for the Welsh Parliament, the committee also called for gender-balanced Senedd. Besides, as indicated by Moya Jones, in March 2020, the Welsh government appointed a committee charged with producing a race equality action plan, following calls from the Welsh Race Forum and broader stakeholders. And following the convening of the First Minister's Black, Asian and minority ethnic COVID-19 steering group work, as well as the socio-economic subgroup report recommendations, the work to develop this action plan was accelerated, and a draft action plan was published last March. And in this document, so that's why, as Moya said, the consultation is still going on, okay, because it was just a draft plan that was published in March 2021. But in this document, the government insisted on the necessity to act to increase the diversity and inclusion of Black, Asian and ethnic minorities, explaining that it is now quite unwilling to use this acronym BAME, preferring the expression, in fact, racialized people, to show the diversity, as Moya was saying, the diversity of this category of people. Okay, so using this, so if you read documents about diversity, it is more and more common now to see this expression racialized people instead of BAME people. So this presentation today aims to study the extent to which the main political parties in Wales applied the recommendations of the committee regarding diversity during the campaign to the May 2021 Senedd elections, considering the fact that the Welsh Conservatives refused to participate in this cross-party committee, and the Brexit Party left it before the report was published. So it will be interesting to consider the strategies devised by the parties, as well as the outcome of the vote and its impact on the representativeness of the Senedd. So first of all, part one, well, quickly applying the recommendations. Part two, the results of the elections. So first of all, applying the recommendations made by the Committee on Senedd Electoral Reform. Well, first of all, this committee had to respect the legislative grounds on the Parliament's commitment to the equality of opportunity, starting with the Government of Wales Act 1998. Just going to quickly remind you, tell you about the legislative framework, if you want, on this issue of the equality of opportunity, starting with the Government of Wales Act 1998, Article 120, a key article, in this act, stating the Assembly shall make appropriate arrangements with a view to securing that its functions are exercised with due regard to the principle that there should be equality of opportunity for all people. And this commitment was reinforced, restated in the Government of Wales Act 2006, Article 77, where in which, in fact, the expression the Assembly was simply replaced by the Welsh ministers. Okay, so the same obligation, but on Welsh ministers and not just the Assembly. And as Moya said, strongly reasserted through the landmark piece, the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act 2015, with the 7 well-being goals identified previously, including a more equal Wales, that is to say, a society that enables people to fulfill their potential, no matter what their background or circumstances. And another goal being a Wales of cohesive communities. And interestingly, Charity, a charity created in 1992 to ensure that women in Wales can enter the workplace and be represented, favored the opportunity of outcome to the equality of opportunities. Okay, so the legislative ground was on the equality of opportunity, but it was an equality of outcome that was stressed by this association. And in an article published on 30th of April 2021, a few days before the Senedd election, the charity complained about the Parliament's lack of diversity. I quote, "Our current Senedd is not reflective of the diverse community that it serves. Better decisions are made by diverse groups of people. Hence why in our manifesto for gender equal Wales, we recommend increasing the size of the Senedd to 90 members to better represent the diversity of Wales." So you see quite a contradictory quote to the opening one, quite interestingly. So this legislative context led to the work of the Committee on Senedd Electoral Reform, published, I was telling you, in September 2020, and insisting on the collection and publication of diversity data by political parties in order to outcome this problem of diversity. So let's study the extent to which the main parties, well, especially Welsh Labour and Plaid Cymru, well, applied these recommendations, because as I was telling you, the Welsh Conservatives refused to participate in this commission. In its evidence to the committee, the Welsh Labour Party was quick to remind that the Labour group consisted of 15 women and 14 men, with a strong representation of women in the Welsh government, and that the party had a strong record of diversity with LGBT, BAME and disabled elected representatives, but without giving precise figures. Okay, so I mean, when I read this evidence given to the committee, I was quite surprised to see that, I mean, the extent to which the party stressed this record of diversity, but without precise figures. Okay, so to prove this this diversity. Besides, the party insisted that there were no practical barriers to the publication of diversity data, since it already collected, in fact, these data as part of the selection process, but these data were on a confidential basis, and the party was calling for a necessary reform to ask successful candidates if they would be willing, in fact, to have their data shared, insisting on their concern that the sharing of data may cause difficulties for some candidates. Okay, and that's why the party, the Welsh Labour Party, refused, in fact, during the campaign for the Senedd election, to publish any diversity data, preferring to publish outcomes, that is to say, figures for elected members of the Senedd and not candidates. As for Plaid Cymru, it did not disclose its evidence to the Commission. Indeed, the Commission had committed, if I may say so, to keep answers confidential. Okay, so there was no obligation to publish the evidence given by political parties, and so Plaid Cymru refused to disclose its evidence, and only a general summary of evidence was published. But in its manifesto for the May 2021 Senedd elections, Plaid Cymru, so the Nationalist Party, dedicated a part to justice and equality, stating, "We will set challenging targets for public sector recruitment for ensuring people with diverse characteristics are visibly represented in government at all levels, with a particular focus on the underrepresentation of women and people of color in senior positions," and adding, "In public and political life, we will publish ethnicity data in relation to pay gaps, elections, public appointments, and health outcomes, as well as improving ethnicity categorization in Welsh public bodies data capture. We will openly encourage political parties and public bodies to consider legal positive action to achieve legal outcomes which reflect the ethnic makeup of constituencies." So very ambitious in terms of diversity and recognizing the diversity of Wales. Nevertheless, this commitment was made if the party obtained a majority in the Senedd, okay, and not during the campaign to the election. And as you know, Plaid Cymru had quite disappointing results, in fact, during these elections. So it is now interesting to study the candidates selected by the main parties for the Senedd election. So I listed all the candidates in each constituency, as well as on regional lists, to figure out the number of women and racialized people. Allow me to use this expression, racialized people. So I apologize in advance, because obviously I did it based on names, photos, which I admit may be a form of colorism, but that was the only way. Well, I tried to look at their identity, presentation, and so on, but well, that was quite the only way to list, you see, these candidates. So sorry, I did not mean to offend anyone with this attitude, okay, on the selection of candidates. So here are the findings. I hope you can see, well, yes, this table. So you see for the main parties, Welsh Labour, Plaid Cymru, and the Welsh Conservatives, even if, as I said, the Welsh Conservatives had refused to participate in this committee. So with first women candidates and next racialized candidates. I'm sorry, it's a bit complex, but there are 40 constituencies in Wales, 20 candidates, 20 members of the Senedd on regional lists for a total of 60. Quite interestingly, the Welsh Conservatives decided for the regional list to present many more candidates, okay, than the 4 candidates for each region. And that's why I've specified that for Welsh Conservative, it's for a total not of 20 candidates, but of 38, in fact. Okay, so you see, you may have an impression that there are quite many women, for instance, for the Conservatives, but on regional lists, 16 out of 38, so total of 26 out of 78. And for racialized candidates, it's quite interesting, to see once again that it's, in fact, if you have a look at Plaid Cymru and the Welsh Conservatives, you may have the impression that they have quite the same proportion of racialized candidates, but out of many more candidates for the Welsh Conservatives, okay, so just to be quite precise. So if I sum up these results, we can see that ahead of the Senedd elections, 48.3% of Labour candidates were women compared to 38.3% for Plaid Cymru, 33.3% for the Welsh Conservatives. However, according to projections made by political consultancy Darin, based on polls data and a 10% margin, the number of women in winnable seats, was much lower. And for instance, this agency considered that out of the 29 women standing for Labour, only 16 were in seats classed as winnable, opposed to 9 out of the 23 Plaid Cymru candidates, and only 3 out of the 26 Conservative candidates were in winnable seats. So I think it was something important to take into consideration. It's very nice to put many women everywhere, but if they are not in winnable seats, that's only for the visibility of women. And that was, the same remark could be made for racialized candidates, as regretted by Race Alliance Wales in a report published in January 2021, in which potential racialized candidates considered that they were not given access to winnable seats, being sometimes even asked to stand as paper candidates, as they regretted. And Professor Roger Owen Scully from the Welsh Governance Centre analysed, I quote, a tendency to prefer the archetypal candidate, usually white, male, straight, middle class, leaving ethnic minority candidates, women, as well as people with disabilities, to be especially affected by this. And some even denounced a form of tokenism displayed by political parties, with one politician participating in the research declaring, "I feel like Vaughan Gething," so then Health Minister, as indicated by Moya, "I feel like Vaughan Gething is the poster boy of diversity. He's the go-to." Okay, so you see this display of candidates, because indeed, if I just come back to the table, if the Labour Party, the Welsh Labour Party, seems to have a high number of racialized candidates, above the 4.4% of the Welsh population, or even 5% now, as Moya said, they are mostly on regional lists, hence very unlikely to be elected, considering the dominant position of the party in Wales and the complexities of the electoral system I'm not going to describe today. So yes, apparently many candidates, but not so much in winnable positions. So now let's move on to the May elections and the outcomes of the election. Well, in 2003, Wales had become the first country in the world to have an equal number of men and women in its assembly. And after the 2016 Welsh elections, 42% of the Senedd were women, and that had risen to more than 48% after Delph Jewell, Mandy Jones, Laura Ann Jones, and Ellen Mary Jones were sworn in. But only 2 members of the Senedd had ethnic minority heritage, representing 3.3% of the members of the Senedd. Following the May 2021 elections, journalists and politicians welcomed the election of the first racialized female member of the Senedd, because we often talk about intersectionality today. So people were so happy to have, for the first time, a woman, with an ethnic minority background elected to the Senedd. Natasha Ashgar, mentioned by Moya, previously. for the Conservative Party has a success. Okay, so journalists and politicians welcome their election as a success, with headlines such as ITV's Natasha Hashgar becomes first woman of color to be elected to the Senedd, or the following message on Twitter: today was a historic moment in the Senedd as Natasha Hashgar took her oath as the first woman of color to be elected as member of the Senedd. And yet she is only the 5th non-white member of the Senedd in its 22-year history. Okay, so huge success, wonderful, rejoicing, but only the 5th non-white member of the Senedd in its 20-year history. Here is the current composition of the Senedd following the May 2021 elections. Okay, so as you can see, there are now 29 women members of the Senedd out of 60. And as Moya said, 3 racialized members of the Senedd. So in fact, we can say that despite calls for better diversity, there is no real change. There has been no real change, despite the calls for action by associations, efforts presumably made by political parties, but as I was saying, for racialized people especially, not really in winnable seats. The 2021 Race Alliance report I was quickly telling you about listed the barriers to minorities' participation in political life, and the answers given by interviewed people were the following ones: institutional and systemic racism for over 60% of them. I mean, more than 60% of interviewed people in this Race Alliance report published very recently considered that they were the victims of institutional and systemic racism, also mentioning cultural racism, intimidation, the race vote, the lack of role models and networks, and intersectional discrimination. Jessica Blair and Matt Matthews stated in 2018 that piecemeal approaches to fixing diversity clearly haven't worked, well, as illustrated by this table. Institutional solutions should be considered. Okay, so since incitement and approaches to encourage diversity apparently are not working, maybe the solution would be institutional. And considering the outcome of these elections, a list of solutions were advocated for the future. So first of all, social solutions, such as educating, informing, training people regarding diversity. Second, political solutions, that is to say, reforming political processes, introducing more transparency, new selection processes with positive action, as shortlisting, quotas for racialized people, as was introduced for women a few years ago. Indeed, effective means as reserving spaces or implementing quotas, twinning shortlists, and zipping shortlists were implemented, but only for women and not for racialized people. And considering the fact that today we have 29 women members of the Senedd, we may think that this was quite successful for women, so maybe the same should be done for racialized people, but the law currently prohibits some of these actions to be undertaken regarding racialized people. And finally, one solution would be, well, suggested by the Committee on Assembly Electoral Reform, was the introduction of legislative gender and diversity quotas. As I was saying, the Welsh government already has the power to legislate for gender quotas, hence could do the same, would like to do the same, is called to do the same before 2030 to introduce quotas in relation to racialized people. In its evidence to the committee, the Welsh Labour Party rejected quotas in an open list system, considering that there was a risk of subversion of the system. Now, to conclude, The Welsh political parties did not really follow the Committee on Senedd Electoral Reform's recommendations, even if they seemed to make some efforts to diversify their candidates' profiles. It is nevertheless necessary to be extremely careful, since it is very easy to make female and racialized candidates very visible, but as I was saying, not in winnable seats. In its anti-racist Wales Race Equality Action Plan for Wales, so published in March 2021, we've talked about a lot today, finally, seen by Charlotte Williams as a landmark, the Welsh government made the following commitment: by 2030, young, Black, Asian and minority ethnic people will see that together we will have seen the first Black, Asian and minority ethnic First Minister in place. Well, time will tell. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Stephanie. So do we have any questions? I think one actually ready.
I have one, yeah.
I have one, right?
If that's okay. Well, first of all, thanks a lot to all three speakers for taking some time to tell us about Wales today. It was extremely enlightening. I think it was important that we have experts on Wales as part of the mid-age seminar series. So thank you very much. And special thanks to Stephanie, of course, for putting together that nice panel and organizing it for us. Yeah, I would actually have a lot of questions, I think, that arise from all three very rich and stimulating presentations. I'm just going to put out one of them to anyone on the panel, really, anyone or everybody, I don't know, as you see fit. I'm curious about the more party political aspect of the question, which has been dealt with by Stephanie a lot already. But I'm curious about Plaid Cymru, if I, pardon my mispronunciation, but I'm curious about whether, because the evidence we've seen presented here seems to suggest they're quite ambiguous. I think Stephanie, I don't know if I interpreted your analysis correctly, but it seems to me, it felt as though they wanted to put out a very progressive and inclusive discourse about racial equality, but that they're reluctant to go too far in that direction. So can we conclude from that that they have a different approach to that compared to, say, the Scots, the Scottish National Party, which has made some efforts to be openly, explicitly inclusive of minorities, with Asians for independence, Asian Scots for independence. So do they have similar organizations of minorities as part of Plaid Cymru, or do they have distinctive initiatives of that kind to try and project themselves as a nationalist party, but an inclusive, civic kind of nationalism?
Well, I think Moya can also answer this question. I can just quickly start by saying that it's interesting you mentioned Scotland, because this year for the Scottish election, there was also the first election of a female racialized member of the Scottish Parliament. But well, yes, I think as Moya was insisting on the linguistic issue and the cultural issue linked with ethnic nationalism in Wales, which is not so much the case, in my opinion, in Scotland. I think it is easier maybe for the SNP to develop a more inclusive strategy. And I think that for Plaid Cymru, there is this, you see, this the fact that Plaid Cymru was first created as I would say, an association to protect the language and the Welsh language and the Welsh culture. And I think it is still very much connected with this aspect, and it's more difficult to open. Okay, well, even if it is trying to, I'm not saying it is not, but you see it is divided, I think, in its well, diversity promises. Well, anyway, it was very, very ambitious, as I said, in its manifesto, and we can imagine that if well, I do not want to make well, utopian politics, but if Plaid Cymru had obtained better results for the 2021 elections, it would probably have put some more pressure on diversity, if that was necessary, because as Moya said, I think that the current government, Welsh Labour government, I mean, even the previous one, was already quite willing anyway to take diversity into consideration. So it would probably have been an element that would have allowed the two parties to work together in a coalition, if a coalition had been necessary, but it's not, considering the good results of the Welsh Labour Party.
Okay,
So,
if I can contribute to this, Plaid have got a massive problem. They've got a massive image and communication problem. And as Stephanie rightly said, it was a party that was founded in the 20s, essentially on Welsh identity and very closely linked to defence of the Welsh language. And they haven't been able to move away from this. And their efforts are not great enough. During the elections for the Senedd, apart from flyers that came through the letterbox, there was nothing. There was no poster campaign. They don't have a great enough visibility, and people dismiss Plaid because they say, "Oh, I don't speak Welsh, so it's not for me." So they can't get over this. They call it the Party of Wales, but they need to make a massive investment in a communication program. But the problem is it's money. You have to be able to finance a campaign, and you also have to have the volunteers and the people, boots on the ground, to go around and talk to people. But it hasn't happened, and that's a real pity because, well, I personally think the Plaid have a lot to offer. And it's not the same as for the SNP, where first of all the language problem doesn't exist, and the SNP have a very strong message. We're running Scotland. We want independence for Scotland. You know, it's a sort of, sorry, Natalie, it's a sort of one-trick pony. This is it. Plaid haven't made that breakthrough. The other trouble is of course the hegemony of Welsh Labour. Wales, since the early 20th century, has been under the control of Welsh Labour, and even someone like Mark Drakeford, who I think has the personality of a tea towel. He has reassured people during the latest pandemic, because he's just been so boring and steady and managed it very, very carefully. And people think, oh, he's a great guy, let's elect him again. Sorry.
Sorry, I have a
Mark Drake.
follow-up question for Moya, because I think it was very interesting what you said about, of course, the importance of language in the history of the Plaid Cymru. But in your presentation, you mentioned that they have some specific plans, but I wasn't quite sure what it was exactly. To do something about, or asking questions to minorities about the Welsh language, or trying, what are they? How are they trying to articulate the question of language? And I don't know if they think about inclusivity of minorities into the Welsh-speaking community. Are they trying to teach Welsh specifically for minorities, or is that not a big issue, a big population enough?
It is. You're right. It is. It has been a massive issue, and credit where credit's due. The Labour government, the Labour governments that have ruled Wales since the beginning, particularly under Rhodri Morgan, have had massive programmes for the promotion of Welsh. Welsh is obligatory in all schools. All children in Wales learn Welsh. And to hold public office in Wales, you also have to be bilingual. So it is massive. But the point is, again, it still seems to be restrictive, because although everywhere you go in Wales, you'll see signs of bilingual. You phone up a body, you get the choice to talk in Welsh. But again, it's still perceived as only concerning a minority. And it's true, it's only 20% of the population, and everybody speaks English. So there are voices raised saying, why are we wasting so much time and money on this effort? But we're wasting time and money on it because it's about cultural diversity. It's about preserving heritage at the same time as moving forward. But if you do go on the REAP action plan, they're very easy to find on internet. You'll see these two questions. So as I said earlier, I'm thinking about replying to it because I'm interested in the question, and I'm interested in this not being lost, the way so many languages around the world have disappeared.
If I may just add something that is quite interesting about the interest for the Welsh language. As Moya was saying, all children in Wales learn Welsh, but the problem is that they don't see the point of speaking Welsh outside school, so they find it nice to learn Welsh at school and so on. But as soon as they leave school, they switch back to English. That is really the youth language, you see, for text messages and so on. Everything is in English and not in Welsh. So, so you see, that's the problem. In fact, there is this still, I think, this cultural dimension of the language that is very much present, but in people's everyday lives, especially for young people, they do not so much use Welsh, and that's why I think we have these frightening or worrying figures about Welsh-speaking people and the declining figures.
Again, that depends where you live, because there are parts of Wales where everything is in Welsh. The police speak Welsh, the shopkeepers, it's all in Welsh, schools are Welsh medium and so on. But it's only 20% of the people concerned.
Okay, I think we have one question from Fabrice Roger from the University of Bristol. His hand has been raised for quite some time, so over to you, Fabrice.
Thank you, Vincent. Yeah, my question, I think, is mostly for Moya and Elizabeth. I'd like to have your view on what I see as a paradox between a country that is moving towards civic nationalism, as we have said, and the result of Brexit. Elizabeth, you mentioned that like areas in South Wales, you mentioned Port Talbot, I think, have been hit hard by Brexit. And issue that if you travel through Wales, at least through South Wales, which I kind of know, you see a lot of signs that say this roundabout has been funded by the EU, for example. So definitely Wales has benefited from EU funding, and yet those areas tend to have voted to leave Brexit. And as we all know, the Leave campaign was fueled by anti-immigration sentiment. So I'd like to have both your views on this paradox.
Well, if I can jump in first, this is something that really interests me and intrigues me. Brexit may have been fueled by an anti-immigration debate, but not really. This wasn't really the case in Wales. The case in Wales and the areas where the Brexit vote, because Wales as a whole voted more massively, I haven't got the figures to hand, to leave the EU than to remain. And the highest voting areas were exactly those areas you've identified, which have benefited from money coming in from Europe, like the Heads of the Valleys Road that goes, it runs east and west, north of Cardiff and Newport, which is now a fabulous road that you can get across Wales. But the people who live in those valleys, they are now third generation unemployed. And they said, what has the EU done for us? We've got a nice road, but it means people don't even come to our villages anymore. They go round them. There's nothing here for us. Let's try something new. The British government might be able to do something better for us, because the EU, yes, we've got a gym. We can't spend our lives in the gym. Yes, we've got a football field. We can't spend our lives there. We need jobs. The situation, these are the areas where you've got 1.7% of racialized minorities. If you go back to that, and if you're interested, I can send you stuff on it. But these people, it wasn't really anti-immigration. It was let's try something new, because life here is just so rubbish.
Okay.
Elizabeth.
Yes, thank you very much, Moya. Moya is the great expert. So, sorry, just a few things. It's interesting to see the evolution of Wales. What I find particularly interesting is to compare the June 1975 referendum with the June 2016 referendum, because in terms of the four nations, it was just the opposite. Because in June 1975, Wales voted in favour of remaining within the common market. So we have to bear in mind that for a long time, in fact, Wales was very much pro-Europe, and perhaps even more than Scotland. But Natalie, who is in the audience, and Edwige can tell you more about that. But talking about that, it's interesting to note this relatively recent evolution in Wales. As I said, you were right to say that, Fabrice, that Wales benefited a lot from the structural funds of the EU, as you said, and that's the paradox to a certain extent. I said that we have to take into account the diversity of Wales. It's mainly the Welsh people from the Welsh valleys that voted for Brexit. Big cities, starting with the cosmopolitan Cardiff, of course, voted for remaining within the EU, as well as Cardiganshire. And my husband, who is from Cardiganshire, was at least very pleased about that. But so I said it's interesting to we have to look at the results, or at the details and the various parts of Wales that voted differently, in fact, in June 2016. And finally, I would like to mention, in a way, the plight of Welsh farmers, because they will be hit, and it has already started, by what they call the hormone or the homegrown lamb coming from New Zealand and Australia. Of course, the problem with Wales is that it will no longer benefit from the subsidies, which are part of the common agricultural policy. So that's a major problem for Welsh farmers, I think.
And in fact, I was going to say Richard Wynne Jones, the day after the Brexit vote, wrote a wonderful article. I think it was published in the Guardian, and he called it "Brexit Through the Gift Shop." Total incomprehension as how Welsh people could have voted to leave the EU when the EU was the source of all their richness.
I was just about to mention another article published by Richard Wynne Jones on this issue, entitled "Why Did Wales Shoot Itself in the Foot?" Okay, following the Brexit vote. So quite the same idea, because as you said, Wales is one of the poorest areas of the European Union, was one of the poorest areas of the European Union, so the one receiving the highest amounts of funds, Objective 1 funds from the EU. Okay, so this paradox, obviously, but which can be explained.
But yes, it's a problem. Again, it's a problem of communication, explaining to people.
Media, the lack of national media.
People just don't know, and also it's also, you know, don't have a referendum. We can open a whole debate about referendums, but yet referendum is this or this. It's a black and white thing. You vote in a referendum for whatever you've got on your mind or that's worrying you at the moment. Don't hold referendums.
Thank you.
I say nothing else, otherwise I'm going to get so cross.
Okay, are there any other questions? Yes, I can see one, yes.
Molde is a doctoral student in this university, so over to you.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. Thank you all for your presentations. They were very interesting. My first question, I actually have I think questions that go together, but a lot of things have already been mentioned, so I may be repeating some stuff. But Moya, you mentioned the Nation of Sanctuary plan, sort of that Wales want to put in place. I wondered how much opposition there is within Wales, and that could be from like the general public, how opposed they are to this idea, but also how opposed they are in general to immigration, but also sort of this diversity. And my second sort of question, again, you mentioned changes in the education system, and they want to talk about the history of the Commonwealth and sort of bringing that diversity to the education system. And I wondered how much opposition there is to that sort of inclusiveness within the education system. I know obviously in some other countries, without naming any names, there is a lot of opposition to, you know, sort of racialized history and trying to hide some of that.
Yeah, well, as far as I can say, there isn't much opposition really. Grumbling. People in the newly reopened clubs might have a moan about it if they've heard about it. Because you might get some grumbling in people who live in Swansea city centre or in Cardiff city centre, but people aren't intolerant. They don't mind if you're going to come and live here and you quiet and you don't disturb our lives. We'll get on with our lives. You get on with yours. That's fine. So really, not much opposition at all. But as for the curriculum, again, I mean, I didn't know anything really much about the RAEP. Until I listened to Charlotte Williams' talk from Aberystwyth on the 8th of June. People don't know, and the communication and media is so poor. So really, there's nothing because there's nobody there's nothing apart from the fact that there have been UKIP members in the Senedd actually elected to the Senedd. The grumbling goes on privately, really. There's no political voices.
But as I've tried to well quickly show, it does not mean that they do not suffer, that these people do not suffer from racism. Okay? Because as I told you, 60%, when I say 60% of interviewed people considered that they were suffering from systemic racism and institutional racism. So apparently there is no position and so on, but something has to be done anyway, because these people are not well represented and not visible, not present in the political life, and not just as members of the Senedd, but also in high positions, okay, in institutions. So you see there is this discrepancy anyway existing.
Can I just make a point? When I told you about the percentage of racialized minorities in Wales, the figure I gave you was 5.2%. And I just did a little bit of calculating here. And it seems to me with 60 members in the Senedd, if 3 of them are from these minorities, are we not at 5%? Are we not? Yes. Is it not representative?
So if I can answer, it is representative, but in fact, some associations consider, because as you mentioned, you said, and that was interesting, but you said that in the census, we have, I'm just trying to find it, but you have it's about 93% of people who identify themselves as white. Okay, in the census. So many associations consider that it means that 7%, in fact, regard themselves as non-white, even if they do not all tick the box. And so it's quite interesting to see that recently there have been many articles asking for the 7% threshold and not 5%, saying that the reality of the situation in Wales is more 7% than 5%. Okay, and that's why they cannot be satisfied with this 5% that we currently have. To partly answer your remark, I mean, as you see today, if you read articles, you will see that they talk about 7%.
Okay.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, Vincent.
Questions. I was wondering about. You mentioned obviously the nature of Welsh nationalism. You defined it as civic nationalism, and given the strong emphasis on the Welsh language, I was wondering about the how could I put it, the reality of linguistic nationalism, and I was wondering whether this did not have the effect of excluding minorities. Obviously, Stephanie answered Pascal's question about the possibilities given to foreigners to learn Welsh. And I was wondering whether this didn't have a sort of the effect of excluding minorities from the rest of the population.
Well, I'll give you the example of the town of Llanelli in southwest Wales. Before Brexit and the exit of quite a few unskilled workers, the Polish population of Llanelli was quite high. You were as likely to hear Polish spoken in the high street in Llanelli as you were Welsh. And Llanelli is in Carmarthenshire. It's a Welsh-speaking area, and Polish incomers were wanting English lessons. They didn't want Welsh lessons because they needed English to get on with their lives administratively and so on, and refused Welsh because they didn't see the point of it. And they were sending their children to school where the kids would learn English, and value was put on English. So it's not so much, it's possibly a self-exclusion, if you like. Why I'm coming into this country, why should I bother to learn Welsh? Because everybody speaks English, and it's English I need, it's a world language. So this is one of the stumbling blocks, really is. You're right, you put your finger on it.
I think it's interesting because it evokes parallels with Quebec, the Quebecois situation, the difficulties of Quebecois nationalism in handling immigration while being a minority language in their own country, if we compare Canada to Great Britain. So.
I think
yeah.
it echoes remarks we were making about the difficulty of Plaid Cymru to become a dominant party in Wales, because really, when you start studying nationalism and national identity in Wales, you can see it's a very complex one, and it's really in between, to a certain extent, ethnic and civic nationalism. That is to say, in my opinion, the Welsh Parliament would like to develop a civic form of nationalism to be more inclusive. That would be more inclusive, but there are still many elements of this ethnic nationalism, and it's very difficult, you see, to move on. And because the Welsh institutions are very recent, I mean, if you take Scotland, it's totally different because, well, I'm not a specialist of Scotland, but I mean, you all know that Scotland on the Union Act was allowed to keep our education system, our legal system, and so on. So they were preserved institutions. But Wales, we started from scratch to a certain extent when the Assembly was created. Well, from the Welsh office, but that was very recent, much more recent than in Scotland. So you see these civic institutions are very young, very recent, and it takes time to assert this civic nationalism. And Plaid Cymru, I think, is, well, illustrating, you see, this transition that is taking place, and that's why it's still, I think, of course, not as successful as the SNP in Scotland. So it echoes this discussion we were having on Plaid Cymru, and this issue of nationalism in Wales is very complex.
But as you said, you mentioned the key word time, and Elizabeth said just now that the difference in the way that the two in or out referendums were the results in Wales in 1975, when Wales voted to stay in the common market, and in 2016 when Wales voted to leave. A lot of time has passed, a lot of water has gone under the bridge. People have passed on, people have been born and come to voting age, populations change and move on. So you have to give time to time for changes to become embedded, for people to become comfortable with what's happening, and for attitudes to change. So sometimes they change.
And as I tried to show in a previous presentation with Elizabeth, there is time is making effects, and I agree, and especially considering Brexit and the COVID-19 crisis, there has really been an impact on the debates on independence in Wales, but not coming so much from political parties, but from associations, from youth movements, and so on. So, but I really think today it's quite interesting to see the evolution of this debate on independence, with some polls today showing that around 25% of people could be in favor of independence for Wales, whereas it used to be 10% on the highest days, on the best days, okay, just a few years ago. So we can see the impact of Brexit, but also of COVID-19, because as Moya said, even if Mark Drakeford is not Boris Johnson in terms of his brilliant attitude, well, anyway, was a reassuring figure, okay, displaying as a professional and not as a clown, and he really made quite a good job, and he was re-elected. He was re-elected with a wonderful result in his constituency compared with the previous elections. So it's quite interesting to see all this. But you see, this issue of independence, I think, is linked with nationalism, what we were saying about nationalism, and maybe I think it could be quite interesting to see how diversity is included in the debates around independence, maybe to allow minorities to find their place in Wales, you see, in an independent Wales and not a multinational state.
Yeah.
So are there any other questions? I don't think we do, actually. So in this case, we'll be coming.
Well, I had plenty, but I could speak for all day, so that I don't think you're really willing to spend your all day talking about Wales. Okay, but thank you everyone for coming today.
I think both Roma and I are very pleased that and very grateful that you organized the seminar. We're very grateful, actually, also, of course, and we're very glad that Elizabeth and Moya took part in this seminar, which was our first event about Wales, and I hope there'll be plenty others. Ones. So we're in the middle of finalizing the program for the upcoming academic year for 21-22, and we will keep you posted about the next seminars scheduled in the autumn and spring terms. And so in the meantime, we wish you a very nice summer. Okay.
Yeah, if you just allow me a final word, I just wanted to remind you that there's going to be the essay conference online, sorry for that, in Lyon in September. And there will be very interesting seminars, and especially, I'm sorry to promote my own seminar, but I'm having a seminar with Gilles Laitier and some colleagues from Cardiff, you see, on multinational identities in the UK following Brexit. And since I have Nathalie Didier present today and participating in this conference, I wanted just to advertise this seminar in very early September. If you're back from holidays, okay, we would be very pleased to have you.
And of course, thank you very much. And of course, the recording of the today's seminar will be available on the blog, on the MIDI blog, very soon, actually. So that will allow other people actually to benefit from your very interesting presentations and perspectives.
And Charlotte Williams' presentation was also recorded and is also available on YouTube if you're interested, if you were not able to listen to her.
And you can access it via the web, via the MIDI blog.
Yeah, I have the link. Thank you both of you.
Thanks a lot.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a very nice summer.
Bye-bye, everyone.
And
have a great summer.
Bye-bye.
See you
Thank
soon.
you very much.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you very much.